Let us remember that we are in the holy presence of God.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم فقال ربكم ادعوني أستجب لكم آمين يا رب العالمين الحمد لله رب العالمين الرحمن الرحيم مالك يوم الدين إياك نعبد وإياك نستعين اهدنا الصراط المستقيم صراط الذين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين اللهم اجمع شمل المسلمين والكريستيان واللومد في مدينة دباو وسلم دائما مجتمعنا هذا بالسلم والأمن والتقدم في بلدنا هذا آمين يا رب العالمين ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب ربنا إنك أنت الوهاب ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار وصلى الله على خير خلقه سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين آمين يا رب العالمين.
In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. Our most gracious Heavenly Father, we come to you today to praise and worship you and give you thanks for all the things you continue to provide for ourselves and our families. Father, we humbly ask for forgiveness for all the times we have offended you, when we forget to acknowledge your presence in the image of our brothers and sisters, and for moments we fail to be good stewards of the blessings you have given us. Continue to guide and protect each one of us, Lord, that we may always walk in the light of your everlasting love and mercy. Grant us, Father, with your comfort in times of distress and with your strength in times of weakness. Bestow upon us your unending grace and healing, that we may in turn become instruments of gentleness and compassion to others. We ask all this in the name of your Son, our Lord Jesus Christ, with the prayer and the intercession of our Blessed Mother. Amen.
Our Lasallian prayer. I will continue, O my God, to do all my actions for the love of you. Saint John Baptist de La Salle,
Pray for us.
Pray
Saint
for us.
Benilde son,
Pray for
Pray for
us.
us.
Pray for us.
leave Jesus in our hearts.
Forever.
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 Good afternoon, everyone. I am Kyla Amor from the Benilde Central Student Government. Once again, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Now, to start, may I call on Presley Stasio, President of Benilde Central Student Government, and Bryce De Vera, President of Benilde Hive, to welcome us to this afternoon's event.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Sense on LGBTQIA. My name is Sam, the President of Benilde Central Student Government.
And I am Bryce, President of Benilde Hive.
Thanks so much for taking your time to be with us here today. We appreciate your interest to be part of this initiative and learning some parts of the history of the LGBTQIA+.
We hope you enjoy and most importantly, get to absorb some facts from this session you may find useful later on. Once again, we hope you enjoyed this session and we welcome you to Sense on LGBTQIA+.
Thank you, Presley and Bryce, for the warm welcome. To introduce our guest speaker, may I call on Mr. Jeremiah Adriano, Inclusion Advocacy Unit Head of the Center for Inclusive Education.
Thanks, Kyla. Known by his colleagues as Gio, Gregorio R. Caliguia III works as a senior research specialist for Casa de Memoria, a fine and decorative arts auction house located in a pre-World War II mansion in Parañaque City. He has a degree in history from the Polytechnic University of the Philippines, Manila, and is completing his MA in Philippine Studies at the Asian Center of UP Diliman, where he specializes in Philippine gay historiography. Gio has written and presented papers on gender and sexuality in various conferences, such as Staging Trouble, Performing Queer Bodies in Metro Manila Pride March, read before the International Federation for Theater Research Asia, Writing the Queer Archive, Bridging Mojares' Scholarship and Philippine Gay Studies, read in Bridging Worlds, Illuminating the Archive, Festschrift for Resil Mojares, among others. At present, Gio's completing his archival research thesis, arguing that an accurate history of the word bakla can reframe our understanding of identities and that are historically defined as and socially disabled by the word bakla itself. Let us all welcome one of my closest friend and classmate in UP Asian Center and the number one fan of Mariah Carey, Mr. Gio Caliguia.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. Hi, I'm Gio. Thank you for your introduction, Jem. Pero I'm afraid to say that I'm not really a number one fan. So baka maraming magalit of Mariah Carey. Anyways, welcome everyone to our talk on LGBTQIA. So um, um, perhaps I'll start. Okay. So okay. So this discussion will be divided into three sections. I decided to divide it into three just to make it digestible, for an hour of session. So we'll start with the problems at the present. So just to give us an overview of the current issues and terms that we can use to better understand the struggles of the LGBT community in particular and of the wider gender and sexuality in general. And then as we look into these categories like the LGBT, SOGI will look also into the lessons that we can find from the past. Since my expertise is really in history, so that's what I will try to share this afternoon. And finally, at the end of the discussion, I'll try to shed light on some of possible ways for us to have an alternative future in the area of gender and sexuality. So perhaps we can start now with the first part. Okay. So problems at the present. We all know that the LGBTQ plus people face various challenges, discrimination, and different forms of abuses. In particular, most of us in the LGBT community are bullied in school, di ba, because of our uh, not usual or not uh, quote unquote normal expressions, based on what the society thinks as the normal. um, and then often even within our family, which we supposed to be the safest spaces for us, we are discriminated against. Some of us could have experienced uh, not just verbal or psychological stress within the family, but sometimes we're being physically abused. Okay, and we have religious biases against LGBT people that also inform uh, these discrimination, and also the um, disenfranchisement, or not giving us access to certain rights and resources, like jobs that are still traditional in a sense. And then we also have a lack of proper representation in media. That is to say, we now nowadays, I mean, we can see gay comedians, we can see different genre that represent LGBT experiences, but uh, we need to qualify also that not all that we see in the television, in the social media, are positive representation. Sometimes we are being reduced as objects of ridicule in comedic films. And this is not something that is recent. If we look back in the 70s and the 60s, this has been a thing. And even way back in the pre-war, we have the gay characters sometimes being used as a comedic relief in the vaudeville, in comedia, and other theatrical presentations. And then we have also issues about laws that could have protected our gender diversity. We're still fighting for SOGI equality bill. And then another issue would be people living with HIV, and even the HIV stigma, because we cannot deny that in the early days of the HIV, it is being tagged as sakit ng mga bakla, or a gay cancer, or a gay disease. And sadly, you can even hear this in family reunions, or even from people that are supposed to be educated enough to understand that this is really not a good way of expressing um, about HIV and people who are living with it. So it's still a fight that we need to work on. And of course, we have issues of sexual harassment and misgendering at workplace. So sexual harassment, this is not only experienced by women. This could also be experienced by men. I mean, cis men or trans men, trans women, or cis women can experience sexual harassment, and that is something that we need to fight against. And also misgendering, by that we mean when we talk to another person, we are not sensitive about how how they wanted to be called, or what pronouns they wish to be used when we are addressing them. And sometimes, just a personal note, in my professional life, um, some of the personals in the office sometimes would, if when they learn that I am a gay person, they would call me ma'am or miss. And then what I do often is that I replied through a joke, so parang hindi naman sila ma-offend na, or hindi naman nila isipin that I am lecturing them. But in a way, I'm trying to extend this soji sensitivity even in my workplace. So, according to a prominent feminist and a pioneering scholar in the study of sexuality, Gail Rubin, we need a radical theory of sexuality and able to combat the persisting sexual oppression, not just for the LGBT persons, or at the time we were called gay and lesbian, so because the terms before were just limited, you know. And according to her, this, if we really want to have a radical theory of sexuality, first we need to identify, describe, explain, and denounce various forms of sexual oppression and erotic injustices. And in able to do this, we would need a refined conceptual tools and able to grasp the subject, which is sexuality. And with that, we need to build upon a rich description of sexuality uh, throughout history and across various cultures. And we don't just want a rich description, but this description must be critical as well if we really want to denounce the oppression. So by having a critical language to convey the barbarity of sexual persecution, that's an important thing to note when we are engaging with the study of gender and sexuality. So with that, here are some of the key terms that are used in the study of LGBT and also in gender and sexuality in general. So here are the terms. We have cis heteronormativity coming out, homophobia, transphobia, patriarchy, and normality. Okay, so what are these concepts, by the way? So cis heteronormativity, it means that the society at large assume that heterosexuality or cis sexuality or cisgender is the default, the normal. And once we assume that heterosexuality is the norm, um, what happens is that we ascribe value to heterosexuality, or we privilege it, while we denounce and we discriminate against other forms of sexuality, such as bisexuality, being gay and lesbian, trans identities, so on, so forth. And then by coming out, the second category, uh, coming out is actually a metaphor, okay, using the figure of the closet. This is actually a western category, no. In the Philippines, we have our own, we call it paglaladlad o paglaladlad ng kapa, no. But until Rostom Padilla's coming out in the television late 2000s, kadkad din ng pakpak, no, that's another metaphor. But the idea here is that when we come out, okay, in public, it must be by the self, okay? This must be a self-disclosure of one's sexuality. The issue here is that sometimes other people are outing us, which is not really a good thing. Because no one has a right to out another person. And sadly, in popular culture, in the media, this is so prevalent that some of our celebrities are being questioned in terms of their sexuality, and then other, other showbiz personalities were profiteering by outing our celebrities, and I think this is not a healthy culture. So next would be homophobia, transphobia. It is actually an irrational fear of and discrimination against gender non-conforming persons. Meaning, gender non-conforming, these are uh, persons whose gender identity do not uh, agree or do not align with what society expects to be the norm, hence cis heteronormativity. And this is actually dangerous, especially for persons who are more visible, therefore vulnerable, such as trans persons and gay and lesbians who were publicly open about their identities. Because even we're now in the 21st century, it's now 2021, uh, there are still people who are so uh, bias against gender nonconforming persons. And there's this book, Gay and Lesbian Movement by Margaret Cruikshank, written in 1992, which asserts that this fear against or fear of uh, gender nonconforming persons is coming from the universal fear of humanity of the unknown. There's a fear of the unknown. And I think in able to remedy this fear, we need to educate and to further learn about the complexities of human sexuality. And next would be patriarchy. So patriarchy is a term that was coined in the late 70s by this scholar Kate Millett, okay, in her book. But there are critiques against the use of the word patriarchy. Reason being is that one scholar said that the word patriarchy is circular in its conceptual usage, meaning it tries to define a phenomenon that creates it. So in a sense, it's kind of limiting, and also it's also limited in terms of its application on societies where at first it might seem na they are not really patriarchal. Like for instance, in the Philippines, we have equal authority given to the mother and the father. So sometimes even mothers were more authoritative than the fathers in the household. But we cannot deny that women are still uh, having or facing inequality in various sections of our society, at workplace and even within the home. So, and lastly, we have gay normality. So, gay normality, what's this? It seems something that's not usually used, no, in common or in everyday life. But the word was actually coined around 2002. The other term was actually homonormativity by Liza Dugan, and then gay normality by Peter Drucker. It is a critical term that is used to question the emerging gay and lesbian cultures in the 80s and 90s, where gay and lesbian families were trying to internalize the heteronormative lifestyle so they feel that they are accepted by the larger society. And this is problematic because the gay and lesbian at the time in the 80s, and then you have LGBT category in the 90s. So let's use the word LGBT. So the LGBT couples or LGBT families were in within the gay normative lifestyle. They were treated as an additional market or a niche uh, within the current phase of capitalism. So now we can see some products being tailor fitted to LGBT persons, like you have hashtag love wins, or you have rainbow colors being painted all over the place just to market LGBT specific commodities and services. And this is actually adding another layer of struggle because we are being reduced as consumers, being reduced to being, you know, the receiving end in the capitalist system. Okay. Okay. So here we have the LGBTQ plus categories. At first, in the 1990s, we have lesbian, gay, bisexual, and trans, which we will elucidate later on. And then it expanded eventually to include queer, questioning. When you say you're questioning, you are actually at the state of you do not yet know what your sexual orientation or your gender identity is. So, in a sense, you are exploring yourself. So, that's what questioning means. Intersex, we can talk about that. Pansexual, two spirited, better to mention it now. Two-spirited is culturally specific a category. It refers to the berdache. It is a two-spirited shaman in Native American cultures. So some of the scholars in the Philippines, they equated or they compare the two-spirited berdache with our pre-colonial bayogin or binabae. But another scholar by the name of Carlin Brewer asserted that our own Bayogin are not two-spirited, but rather they are trans women. They transform themselves into womanhood so they can fully assume their role as spiritual healers and teachers to the pre-colonial communities. You have asexual, and ally. So the term ally means that you are not part of these previous categories, the LGBT plus, but as a cis person or as a straight, quote unquote straight person, you are fighting alongside our struggle. And then nowadays we have the SOGESC. So at first it was only SOGI, especially in the international discourse. In United Nations, they use SOGE without the E because the gender expression or the GE is hard to qualify across different cultures, different countries, because what may appear as masculine or feminine in one country may be deemed as otherwise in another. And then eventually they added SC, which means sex characteristics. It pertains to the anatomical, to the chromosomal, hormonal, or genitalia, our physical differences. No, whether you're male, female, or intersex at birth. But these two frameworks, okay, although they coexist and they are now used in the advocacy as co-equal terms, another scholar intrigued their usage. Actually, it was Dennis Altman, an Australian pioneering gay activist and writer, way back in the late 60s and the 70s. And then he said, this was written around 2013, that uh, the LGBT category is kind of limited because it ossifies, or it kind of crystallizes, or it assumes that these categories are in a way fixed. Specifically, in terms of these three categories, when we use LGBT, we assume that, for instance, a lesbian person uh, or a lesbian identity or a same-sex desire and same-sex behavior are co-equal categories. Actually, they are not. You can be a straight person, but you can experience a desire for the same sex. So that's what Dennis Altman is trying to say. So instead of freezing the identities, he wanted to disturb the way we conceive, the way we understand, the way we articulate sexuality. So this is a very helpful framework when we look into the past, when we look into different periods in history, because gender and sexuality in the past, or the way these are understood in the past, are not the same way as how we interconnect identity, behavior, and desire today. So perhaps we can further understand the interconnection between LGBT and SOGI here when we use SOGI SC as a prism to further dissect these LGBTQ plus identities instead of putting them against one another. What do I mean by that? So we can look into these examples. So when we speak of sexual orientation, or the SO in SOGSC, it actually refers to our attraction, whether it is sexual or it is romantic. So here are other some categories under the sexual orientation. So you have heterosexual, uh, which refers to a person who is attracted to a person of different gender. If you happen to be attracted to a person of the same gender, which is my case, okay, and you're a lesbian, okay, or a gay. Sorry, I am a gay person. So you're either a lesbian or a gay person if you're attracted to a person of the same gender. And then you are bisexual if you are attracted to more than one or even more than two gender uh, person. So you have here pansexual, meaning you are attracted to almost all genders imaginable. Because remember, the way we imagine sexuality nowadays is so diverse, it's so pluralized compared to how it was like, let's say, 16th in the 16th century. People at the time could only imagine man and woman, but now we have a plurality of sexualities. And then you have polysexual, which is entirely different from pansexual because by pansexual, it's almost you're covering everything. In polysexual, it can be more than just two, okay? Or maybe a three. You may be attracted to a cis man and a trans man, but you're not attracted to a gay man, let's say. So, And then fluid, I think it speaks for itself. Okay, you're kind of not fixing your bisexuality into either or. You're not just more feminine bisexual or more masculine bisexual. You're really in a sense experimenting. Okay, in this sense. Okay, and then you have queer. Queer is actually a critical term. uh when we say queer, you are critiquing or you are combating, you are dismantling heteronormativity. So it is a radical concept. Okay. And also, in literary and cultural studies, we use the term queering, as a verb. You're trying to queer certain identities. So for instance, in 1997, there's a debate whether bakla ba si Rizal, no, written by a Filipinist scholar, and then it received a reply from an English scholar naman I mean English language and literature scholar. In response, was Rizal gay? So they're in a sense queering Rizal's identity, but the response actually affirmed that we cannot call Rizal bakla or gay or homosexual because the categories in his time were entirely different from how we understand bakla homosexual today. So asexual, it's a kind of a tricky term. Why? Because before I had an opportunity to interview um, Father Richard Mickley or Bishop Mickley, who is the founder of Metropolitan Community Church when we were doing our undergraduate thesis. And then I learned from him that the word asexual is commonly understood as you don't experience any pleasure or desire um, in your genitalia. That's the general understanding. But actually, the term asexual is broader than that. The word asexual refers to a person who do not put sex at the center of his personhood and not at the center of the way a person looks for a companion, meaning in whenever you are in a relationship with another person, you do not prioritize sexual intercourse. You can still be attracted and intimate with one another without engaging in sex. So that's being asexual. So let's move to gender identity. So you have cisgender, transgender. I need to qualify that cis and trans, no, the first what do you call this? The prefixes are actually adjectives. So when you call a person man and woman, you need to qualify if you're trying to say that they are cis woman or trans woman, no. So in a sense, we affirm that trans women are women and trans men are men. No, that there should be no discrimination in amongst our gender identities. No, so when we say cisgender or cis person, these are persons who were whose assigned sex at birth is aligned with how they feel with their self-identified gender. So for instance, I myself is a cis gender gay man. I am comfortable with my body. I am comfortable expressing myself using masculine pronouns with masculine attire and etc. I may have some feminine behavior or feminine expressions, but I am comfortable with my body. I'm just aware that I am attracted to a person of the same gender. I'm attracted to other men. And then you have transgender, which you can also dissect into two subcategories. You have binary trans, trans woman or trans man. What does it mean? When you say a person is within the binary trans framework, it means that they are comfortable being placed between masculine and feminine dichotomy. Okay, because there are other persons who are not comfortable with this categorization, that you are framing them within a binary lens. So these are non-binary persons or gender non-conforming persons, such as gender fluid, bigender and agender. And actually if you kind of think of it, all of us are in a sense gender fluid persons. I myself, I must say that in my 20s now, I as a gay person, I am comfortable with expressing my masculine side. But when I was in my high school years, I must say that I am in the feminine side of being a gay person. So in a way, my own sexuality shifts as well, as I live my life through the years. And I think this is a common experience for all of us. Uh, so aside from G, we have GE, gender expression. So whether you're feminine, masculine, or you're a mix of this, you're androgynous, or you don't subscribe to anything at all, you disturb categories, so you are a queer person. And then sex characteristics, this is more of a medical prescription or ascription, no, of being female if you happen to have, the female assigned uh, genitalia, or you are having the male assigned genitalia at birth. Sometimes you have a mix of this, or you're an intersex. I remember when I was a kid, around late 90s or early 2000s, there was a case in the TV show, what do you call that, Investigador by Mike Enriquez, hosted by Mike Enriquez, where there's a teenage uh, man or a teenage boy who who was experiencing menstruation, no, even his external genitalia is completely of the male ascribed genitalia. So he has a penis, he has a scrotum, he has the testes, but he doesn't have the exterior female genitalia. So his menstruation cannot come out. That's why he's feeling an intense pain. But I'm not sure what happened eventually with that person. So if any one of you has the knowledge of this as well, you may share it in the chat box. So now, with these insights from the present, we can now move to the second part with the perspectives from the past. So, usually in history, the way we study Philippine history, we divide it into periods. In the pre-colonial, the early colonial, the Spanish colonial, American Japanese periods, and the post-colonial or the contemporary times. It depends on the framework of the historian how you will divide history. But this, since periodization is actually a subjective theorizing, I must say, no. But the question today would be, how can we do a soji conscious history? No, how can we dissect the past with our knowledge of sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, and not to say sex characteristics as well? So in the field of gender and sexual history, there are two ways of looking into sexuality historically. You have the essentialist model over here, which assumes. Hello, what? Okay. Am I still here? Can you still see me? Hello, okay pa. Okay. So the essentialist model assumes that our sexuality, our sex drive, our urges, our pleasures is a given, a natural given that across time it doesn't change, no? So the homosexual in the past is the same homosexual today. The homosexual in the future will be the same. So this is kind of problematic in a sense because uh, the constructionist, the other side, no, argues that even we have this biological or natural phenomenon uh, in our bodies, these bodily experiences are not existing in a vacuum. These experiences are rather defined and redefined through time. Okay, so in one moment in history, we have certain names for certain categories. We may call the uh, men who were experiencing uh, femininity as hermaphrodites in the past. So it's a historically specific category. Okay, but now we are in a more enlightened position to say that this gender or sexuality needs to be further interrogated to fully account of what it actually was. So that's the constructionist model, and most of the historians are favoring the constructionist model, and that's what we will utilize today. No? So okay, sorry. Okay, so we have here the two cases. No, I'll try to present two cases from the archive. So let's start with the first one. So the transgender from the pre-colonial and early colonial period. So this is a painting by Carlos Boto Francisco depicting the Babaylan as a healer. You have here a Bayogin or a trans woman shaman. Okay. So here's a record from the Boxer Codex. This is actually a manuscript from the 1590, which mentioned the word Bayogin, no? Um, and then I think I will present it later. Uh, and then from another record from the Visayas by Alcina from Historia de las Islas de Visayas, you have the term asog. Combes, though in the original text he didn't use the word bido, but in Mindanao around late 19th to early 20th century, the word bido pertains to trans women, okay, or what we might see today as trans women. And surprisingly, um, um, most of these studies in the LGBT scholarship here in the Philippines haven't or failed to see in San Buenaventura the use of the word babayinin as early as 1613. And I want to compare these 16th century category of babayinin, or now we call it binabae, no? So it's really a historical category pala, no? With other identities in the Pacific. You have the Faafafine, the Binabinaine, Fakapefine, and Wakawaine, no, across the Pacific. And why do I want to highlight this? No, because if we compare the expansion of the Austronesian language, no, since 350 years before present up to today, we can say that the Babayinin, the Binabae, could have existed as early as 3,500 years before present, centuries or even millennia earlier than 16th century. No, we already have the Babayanin. And then as the Austronesian language expanded from Taiwan down to the Philippines and then southern to Borneo and then westward to Madagascar and then eastward here up to the Easter Island, Hawaii and New Zealand, you can see that the Fafafaine could have existed around 1,200 years before present. The Binabinaine in Kiribati, Fakafafine in Tonga, at the around the same time, and then you have in Maori culture the Wakawaine in New Zealand in around 730 years before present. So this is actually helpful also to expand our history because the Binabae has a limited history. Um, uh, so as I was saying earlier, here's an excerpt from the Manila Manuscript or the Boxer Codex. So you can see in the second paragraph in this text that I shared here, the Spanish phrase. But of course, for everyone's um, what do you call this? Convenience, I translated it. No, I actually get an English translation from Souza and Turley. No, and the text actually says or describes the Bayogin as someone or as a woman. Okay, they dress like women, and then they're feminine, so feminine in their ways that you would think of them as women at the time. Okay, they only framed men versus women. Okay, so they would think of the Bayogin as women if they didn't know that person. And then they're further described as impotent in the reproductive act. That is to say, they do not use their male genitalia in the intercourse, but rather they sleep as a wife to a man, and also they have carnal knowledge about this. In short, they are submissive. In other translations by Carlos Carino, they call the Bayogin as sodomites, but that is another historical category. No, so eventually, when these interaction between the pre-colonial culture and the colonizers took place, the transgender identity has been demonized, has been reduced into a moral defect, a spiritual disease, and as well as a physiological degeneracy. No, in the later years, so the Bayogin or the trans women in the past were regarded as agents of the devil alongside the dikbalang, alongside the aswang, the manananggal. So if you're interested in studying these creatures of the dark, you would encounter along them the word bayogin. And the bayogin is described as a man who is dressed as a woman. That's the description. You can have it in San Antonio. I think the source is available in archive.org, the actual primary source, if you can actually read the 17th century 17th 18th century Spanish orthography, no? And then we're also described as defectos morales, no, in Fray San Agustin's confessionario copioso. No, in the confessionals were considered as defects. So in the Spanish times, the only way for them to quote unquote correct us is to have us brought into confession, to purge our sins, and to to have a pure morality, no. And then during the American period, sexual degeneration, no, as a category emerged. What do we mean by these? There were records by the colonial officials, especially mostly men, who said that they were experiencing lack of sexual virility in the tropics. So when they experience it in the Philippines, they call it Philippinitis. When they experience it in Guam, they call it Guamitis. No, this is according to the work of a medical doctor and turned historian Warwick Anderson, no, colonial pathologist. But I traced this, no, this ascription of sexual degeneration to environment in a much earlier work by Sir Richard Burton's, no, and his notion of sotadic zones. You can actually find this in his work on the Arabian Nights. No, at the concluding part, he used the term sotadic zones to refer to this section, or rather sections of the globe, where he ascribed the practices of pederasty, or an intergenerational sexual relationship between an older male and a younger male, and also he ascribed to sotatic zones the prevalence of homosexuality and other forms of quote and unquote perversions. No, so that's the source also of the photo. And then I want to share now what I would say an interesting rediscovery from the archives. So this is actually from Arte y Regla de la Lengua Tagala, no, from 1610 by Francisco Blanca de San Jose. This is not yet appearing in any other work, so I'm sharing this first time. Um, I saw in this Kapitulo 14 in the 14th chapter about the usage of the prefix pagin. Pagin alakin ang tubig o ang alak, no? Which speaks of transmutation or change, no? When you attach the prefix pagin to a word or a name, the word will begin to mean transmutation or change, no? In particular, in this rule number 8, no? In this enclosed section, you can find in the last three lines, mapagin babayi niya ako, no seake meage este Jesus mujer, no? Baginyari o mapangyari ay lalaki man dati ay kanyang mapagin babaye. Como este que siendo a varón lo hizo mujer. So here, okay, in translation, in a sense, Fray Francisco Blancas de San Jose ascribed or attributed this transmutation of a man into a woman to Jesus, to God. Okay. So when I found this, I was in shocked because oh my goodness, I'm not expecting to find um, this kind of narrative, okay, in a 1600 text, okay, where most of the scholars would think that the bias against the what we would call as LGBT in the past were so prevalent. But again, as a budding historian, as a scholar, we need to be critical. Why this appeared in this text, and does this mean that at the time transgenderism is already accepted? We need to step back and to rethink, no. So I think what San Jose is doing here is that he's trying to talk of fear towards Jesus's power that is capable of turning a man into a woman. Yet this fear emerges from a fear against uh, this disturbance of the natural order. When you do a gender transmutation, okay, you're converting a man, which at the time was thought to be a God-given, naturally given phenomenon that is unchangeable. Okay, it's kind of fearful. Okay, imagine being in the 16th century facing this. And what intensifies this fear is that it is also a fear out of irreversibility. Irreversibility, once done, the man will become a woman. And what's more fearful is that in this short excerpt from San Jose, this irreversibility is actually willed and enabled by Jesus, by Jesus himself, the God, the Son, no? God the Son. But I wouldn't add na in this discussion because it would take much time and space. But I did a closer analysis of the text, and I found out that although this is an interesting insight, the whole, or in general, San Jose was not actually really promoting transgender rights in a sense in the 16th century, but rather he's also speaking of transgender phenomenon or gender transmutation in a negative way. He's actually equating this pagiging binabaye or being a trans woman and lalakinin being a trans man to a sexual or moral defect. He's calling this actually an enfermedad or enfermedades. So these are disease, no? Disease, sakit, no? Similar to aguluhin. Aguluhin in 16th century means adultery. So he's equating uh, not transgender not only as a disease but as a sin against God. So we need to be careful also when we are reading the text, no. But it is also interesting why did San Jose try to include this kind of 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 text, no, in his writing. And to me, um, I think, in a sense, San Jose is trying to incorporate in his arte y lengua uh, the side of the natives. Because remember, the purpose of arte lengua was actually to prescribe how to communicate with the early Filipinos, to use this as a tool for other missionaries, no, as a guide for other missionaries how to engage with the early Filipinos. So in a sense, this is what Vicente Rafael would call a contracted colonialism. You are contracting, you are negotiating. You don't want to repel the early Filipinos, so you want to win their hearts, their minds, and so you are incorporating this fragment of their culture, of their worldview. So the Western uh, i- uh, interpreter, translator, missionary would already know what to do in such situations. That's what I think this excerpt is about. Huh? So now let's move on to the second case, male to male friendship. What do we mean by this? Okay, so in December 1951, when I was doing my archival research for my thesis, to qualify pre-war bakla, no, the usage of pre-war bakla and also the post-war usage of bakla, I found this interesting text by Remy Mulo, no, or Bullo, no, where she's really disturbed by how men were so fond of one another that they are publicly displaying this. So she started with this line, and in the next page she said this: why do men hold hands, okay, in public or in streets? No, when women were holding hands, we are being sanctioned, but um, men can do this freely. Okay, they're like giggling on streets like two schoolgirls. They're breaking away now, and then eventually they will hold hands again. They're like lovers, no? They're like two birds on lovers lane, and uh, this may intrigue those who are into querying, no, historical texts, no. So you can find this in UP Main Library. They have this in the microfilm section, okay. Um, and then what this actually shows, no, is a case of male friendship, which was so prevalent in the early 20th century, that you can be close to your male friends without being branded as homosexual, no, unlike nowadays when you are holding hands with another uh, male at birth person, you will be immediately branded as bakla, bading, bex, no. So in literary and cultural studies, this is called homosocial bonds. It is popularized by scholar Eve Sedgwick, where she situates the homosocial bond between the homosocial continuum. And then the term homosocial is actually coined to be distinguished from the homosexual, meaning there are certain relations among men that reinforces, no, these male bonding, no, the same formula that structures or that creates patriarchy. It's a male to male bond, no, but when this bond is being crossed, no, towards something sexual, it, it's bridging to homosexuality. So this is really a critical term, I must say. And male to male bonds or homosocial bonds, once strengthened, sometimes it would lead to the exclusion of non-men, women, and queers. No, so here's another insight from the archive. This is from 1920. Uh, I think this is from Angwika, a fortnightly magazine, or it is released every twice a month. No, where I find this very interesting description of friendship between two men. Actually, they were businessmen. No? The text described them as lumakad ang panahon ay para namang niyayari ni tadhana ang gininto ang lubid ng dalisay na pagsasama na tinali ang dalawang damdamin tungo sa isang mithi. Kaya sumpa ang araw na ang dalawang damdaming iyo'y nagkatagpo at yumari ng isang kasunduan. So they're being described as somewhat in a romantic sense, no, if you judge it based on today's perspective. But at the time, this is completely um, the way they would describe an intimate relationship among uh, men or males at birth persons. So I'm trying to look on my notes. Sorry, forgive me. Um, because I noted here that in some parts of the text, uh, you would only find a brief description about their wives, no? Parang shortly, their wives are being mentioned. Uh, and I think this is an essential sentence, no, in the text, because that will affirm that these two men are just friends. Okay, and we should not question their sexuality. No, it's in a sense, this is a formulation of homosocial bonds, that you are strengthening the intimacy between two friends, but without suggesting homosexuality between them. No, so um aside from this, so why I'm presenting this male to male friendship, if they're really friends, what this has to do with sexuality, no? The next part will oh, here pala I have the lines, no? So it's more homosocial than homosexual. So here naman are examples of homosocial bonds, but which are already bridging or bordering alongside homosexuality. This is from a book, no, by John Silva, one of the early gay advocates in the Philippines. No, he's the director of the Ortigas Library. In his book, he has these photos, no, of male to male friendship, but you can actually sense, no, in some ways that there is a kind of more than just friend relations, no. In particular, with the photo on the right, no, those two guys, you can actually see here, no, a letter, no, parang there's an inscription which reads as um, Bebing, in the name of our friendship, please accept this portrait, but consider it great, for there is a hidden symbol in it. A hidden symbol. I do not know. I do not know what the hidden symbol is, or maybe we already know the hidden symbol, but we just kind of unsure because it's not explicitly said. But on the other photo on the left, you can see a trio. But the other one, no, yung nakatayo, the one standing, is somewhat parang out of the picture. Parang the two on the left are, closer, more intimate. Parang the other guy is holding the one seated on the chair, and then yung isa parang saling pusa. That's the description, no? So you can find these photos in the book. No, I think the Ortigas Library is selling this still, no? A token of our friendship. No? So from these insights from the past and with our knowledge of the current struggles, we want to have possibilities for alternative futures. No, so number one, with the transgender and pronouns. Okay, I want to highlight these alternative possibilities or what insights from the past and present we can use as tools to create alternative ways of looking into gender and sexuality, not in the future, but maybe now. No, first, Bayogin, the Binabaye, and the pre-colonial cultures were seemingly accepted, but today we are hardly tolerated. Diba? So you will still see the dichotomy between toleration and acceptance. In gender studies, in particular in LGBT studies, we strongly use this language. No, we use this language that in the Philippines we are tolerated, meaning the society will tell, we accept your sexuality, pero you have to do this. You have to not to do that. Parang there are conditions, no? And that is not acceptance, no? Even in the fight for Soji equality bill, no? You can still hear now, we don't need Soji. Well, we don't need Soji bill because Philippines is already an LGBT friendly country. We're accepting you regardless of gender differences. Pero you have that line, the pero line, diba? Diba? We love the sin, we can accept the sinner but not the sin. You have that kind of dichotomy, diba? That's the tolerated part. But we need to also be critical when we use the term um, accepted, no? Or acceptance, because the category of acceptance assumes that our identity, our self as affirmed identity, must be accepted by the society before we can affirm it ourselves. No, I strongly disagree with that. And this affirmation must come from ourselves. And that is the lesson from the transgenderism in the past. But aside from that, the examples of the Bayogin in the 16th century and even way back, no, baka nga as early as 3500 before present, no, it doesn't matter what is between our legs, no. The Bayogin, the Binabae, the Asog showed us that in the early times, what it means to be woman, what it means to be man, does not rely on the genitalia. but rather on our social roles. Okay, if a person desires to be a woman, she can be a woman, and society sees her, accepts her as a woman. And not only in the pre-colonial times, I must say, there is this anthropologist, Schlegel, who studied the Terurai culture in the 60s. And then there is this case of a transgender, a trans woman music player, a zither player named Uka. And then when he asked another local, another Terurai, so Uka is a man who turned into a woman. And then the Terurai was disturbed by this. No, she is a woman. One becoming a woman. So in our society, we're really um, not fixing sexuality with our genitalia. And I think this is an important lesson. If we want to move our advocacy, our academic and activist position in the LGBT and SOGI struggles. No? And this is also important, by the way, with understanding intersex conditions, because there are persons who may appear as one particular sex or one particular gender, but we do not know what's their genitalia, no, and we shouldn't really rely on the genitalia in terms of defining our identities. And secondly, about the homosociality and the SOGESC. So I want to echo what Dennis Altman is trying to tell us. When we study sexuality and gender, the LGBT in particular, historically, we should look at the desire, the behavior, and identity as not uh, tagged in one string. Okay, the homosexual desire, the homosexual identity, and the homosexual behavior are not coming together as one thing, no, but rather even in everyday context, a person who may self-identify as, let's say, a straight man can even experience homosexual relations, no, but that does not define his identity, no? So I think this is something illuminating for us. Kasi there are cases that when a person or a male person has a relationship with a person deemed by society as gay, homosexual, or bakla, this person, the former, will automatically be tagged as a bakla. No? This phenomenon, I think, happened around the 90s. Kasi in the early years, around 1980, 1970s, that was not the case. No? The macho male person is not considered bakla. Even the macho male person has a relationship with a what we would call now as trans woman, no, um, or binabae or bakla, no, um, in the past. And then aside from this, we can also um, look into um, history of identities, no, uh, independent of desire, no, just like the example earlier, no, the what do you call this, the male to male friendship of the two businessmen, no, si Tobirio and the other guy, no, from the present day perspective, we might think of the description as somewhat homosocial, if not bordering to something intimate, no, so that must be something that a matter of desire for in an intimate friendship, but within this frame of desire, we can further dissect, no, not all forms of desire are sexual. It can also be platonic, it can also be just intimate, or something else, no. So um okay. And thirdly, I want to stress, no, that we should never out another person's sexuality. So in terms of homosociality, 'di ba? This is really important. As I mentioned earlier, the case was in ano yan, no, in the show business, in popular culture. No, the celebrities, we are often intrigued whether a male actor or a female actress, no, is is not so called straight, no. So it's not a good thing to out another person. If you really want to know the sexuality, the sexual orientation of the person, it's better to ask them in private, no. And now I want to move forward with the notion of safe space. Okay. um just an overview, the term safe space is heavily debated, no. Some were not really pro to this concept. They're not liking the concept because some are looking into the category as uh, damaging the freedom for free speech. Some were seeing the safe space as a limiting category. But of course, this will be a topic for a different discussion. But I want to to add lang siguro. I want to add a deeper meaning with what we mean by safe space. Kasi parang in the US, this is especially true, no, in the mid 2010s. They're accusing safe space as infantilizing the studentry, no. Parang it's kind of unfair to judge, no, the younger generation of being, of resorting to authority figures and so. But what I want of us to think of safe space is something like this. I want everyone to be a safe space for one another. What do I mean by that? We ourselves are creating the space. Space is not something that we can objectively reduce as, oh, it's something out there or something that we can enter and go out. But rather, the space is something that we create, we generate, we actively participate in. Okay? And by being a safe space for another person means that we need to alter our mindset. We need to educate ourselves of what our differences in terms of sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expressions, sex characteristics might mean to one another. And when we have this enlightened perspective from the everyday context of society, from the different lessons in history, from the archive, so I'm inviting everyone to also engage in archival work, we will have a better future with a more inclusive language, a more inclusive approach, a more inclusive um, perspective toward our gender and sexual diversity. And a final quote, perhaps, from a pioneering historian of LGBT, Jeffrey Weeks, in his book Sexuality. Uh, Here is his reminder. No, if we begin to ask the correct questions, when we might find the way through the maze, no, we shall not find at the end of the journey a prescription we are not trying to correct, but rather we want to find a framework which will allow us to come out in terms of our diversity, to refine in sexuality new and better opportunities for creative relationships, agency, and choice. Thank you so much.
Okay, Sir Gio, thank you so much for the lovely talk. Siyempre, we wanna thank you first. Actually, ang dami ko natutunan kasi it's more of history. Usually kasi what I understand or what I'm learning now, more on the current. So, siyempre, yung mga, modern understandings now of the LGBTQIA plus community. So, with that, sir, I wanna ask lang, very curious. It wasn't entirely part of your uh, talk, pero, sir, how do you properly approach or ask someone regarding their pronouns? So, example, parang either through email, same emails, or in person. So, how do you ask them na, hey, what are your pronouns? I'm also just trying to relate from last year's Usapang Pangkarapatan from Beehive and CSG. So, it was one of the questions raised. Tapos, yun po. So, ano kayang pwedeng approach gawin?
Well, actually, we're still parang that's still a parang a recurrent thing, 'di ba? Parang it's really hard to know a person's pronoun. Even I, coming from the professional or workplace na rin, I've been encountering people of different or diverse genders, no. Usually what I do, I stalk them. Number one, I look at their their public profiles if there's any, and then um sometimes naman I try to just to be polite, but to ask them in a separate thread perhaps, no, or if I have their number, no, or sometimes pero kasi yung email conversation, hindi masyado yung case eh. Mostly in person. I mean, my work kasi in the arts industry, I also explain objects eh, the objects that we sell to people. And then sometimes I try to avoid at first. I try to avoid pronouns. So I'm just using yes po, ganyan ganyan. I'm avoiding using the word ma'am or sir. And then I'm trying to build the rapport at the beginning, and then when I feel it's something comfortable, and I would just ask. I mean, directly. To be direct is just, it's just fine. Medyo may awkward atmosphere in the middle of it. Like when I ask, I hope you don't mind, but is it may I know your pronoun, or how do I you want me to address you? Sometimes they will tell you just call me by my name, or something like that. So even in writing, if you are not sure of the pronoun of the person, you can just repeatedly use, although it's awkward, not very rhetoric. You can just repeat their given, or their name, the name of their choice. So yun, that's the safest way to do. Yun.
Okay, thank you so much, Gio. I believe Bryce has a question also.
Okay.
Since na-discuss yung history, may I ask if saan nanggaling yung Soji SC?
Okay. If I'm not mistaken, I'm not really an expert, no, on the etymology, no, ng soji. My professor kasi, our professor actually ni GMI, Dr. Caroline Sobechea. It's so fortunate that we're able to to attend her class. She is working in she used to work, and I believe she's still working with the United Nations. She is our um representative on in women's and gender rights, no. And then in one of our sessions nabanggit niya yung soji kasi in graduate school we often present papers, we do research ganyan, and then we write papers based on our expertise. And of course, knowing na ang research expertise ko is on gender, sexuality, and LGBT, in particular, gay history. So parang when I talked about this, she gave an insight. Sabi niya, in United Nations, we don't use the E. I learned it from her, no? So around 2000s daw ito. No, there are parang mga agreements, yung mga principles, no, na na form around 2000s, and inadapt yung term na soji at first, SOGI. Um, I think it was mid 2005 or 6, around that date. And then um, the reason being is that um, they find yung term na LGBT as limiting to a particular social group. What the international discourse wants to happen is that to become more inclusive, not just for the LGBT, pero gusto nilang i-relate yung experiences with the whole humanity, no, the whole humanity. Kasi our issue is not just it's not just about the discrimination towards us, but we want to affirm that we are just like everybody else. We are not different. We want to break that barrier. So doon nag-emerge yung notion na SOGI. That SOGI is not, even the SOGI Equality Bill now, that's what we're trying to educate to the larger society, na hindi lang ito tungkol sa laban ng mga bakla, lesbiana, trans, bi, queer, etc. Ito ay laban nating lahat. We want to have a safe space for everyone. We want to fight for gender equality of everyone. That's why we are promoting the usage of the term SOGI, ESC. Now, yung E nadagdag siya eventually in a more academic discourse, no? Uh, Dito sa Pilipinas na include yung sa ano natin sa bill, no, yung House bill and the Senate bill for SOGI equality. Kasi medyo medyo malalim na rin yung scholarship natin on sexuality, no? Yung SC naman, as I mentioned na rin yata kanina pero baka in passing, dinagdag siya kasi there were critics, no? There were critics against the SOGI na model kasi nakakalimutan yung biological, anatomical, chromosomal features. So madalas ito nanggagaling doon sa mga evolutionary biologists, yung mga medical practitioners, no? And even within the feminist movement, of course, some of us were aware na meron exclusivity towards the trans. Hindi naman lahat ng feminist ganon, but there's a certain string of feminism, the so-called TERF, no? Yung trans-exclusive radical feminism, no? Na medyo ang binabato nila, yung LGBT movement is forgetting sex. We're privileging gender constructs. So ang bato nila yung mga physical, anatomical, and the chromosomal, etc. No? So yun, medyo para to embrace lang the diversity, they added the SC. I think this is around mga 2010s, mga 2014, 2015. I'm not sure lang with the exact dates. Pero just parang not a disclaimer but rather just to be objective in things. Medyo complicated talaga yung pag-aaral ng gender and sexuality kasi kung dadagdagan mo pa siya ng politics, ng scholar, no, kung saan ba siya nanggagaling. So, yun. I hope I answer your question.
Thank you, sir.
Okay, thank you so much, Sir Gio. Guys, I would just like to take this time to acknowledge the former SDG of Benilde, Dean
Hi.
George.
Yeah.
Hi,
It's
I
nice.
think meron din po kayong reaction.
Yeah, it's nice to be back. It's nice to be home. And Gio, I also have to tell you that I'm a product of the UP Asian Center, except that I graduated in 2003. So that I'm already your parent. Just to go back to the discussion, I think it's important for us to talk about gender and development because a lot of discussion focused on identities. And I was looking at, like, for instance, if like the institution would want to create safe spaces, then we have to go back to the establishing a gender framework for an organization, for instance. And out of that framework, it matters that you already discussed the use of gender fair language, for instance. But that's just one aspect of it all, because it's essentially a gender framework for an organization under the scope of gender and development will really address the problems. Because it's when you talk about SOGI and the LGBTQ issues, there's a broader problem. Of course, you can talk about patriarchy, toxic masculinity, but I think the issues that need to be addressed is really do we come forward as an institution in realizing that there's really a problem. And of course, because Benil, you have to understand that oppression is intersectional. So I think my friends in the Center for Inclusive Education know that, I mean, your treatment of me as an openly gay man would be very different because of my gender expression as masculine, and because I come from a privileged class. And as this is very different from how you treat, let's say, a trans woman who comes from a lower socioeconomic status. Meaning, oppression is not compartmentalized to your sexual orientation and your gender identity. If your socioeconomic status is, if you belong to class D and E, of course, my friends in the deaf community would also attest that the treatment of the LGBT community in the deaf community uh, is uh, is worse than the treatment of, let's say, a gay man who, like me, who comes from a privileged class with a masculine gender expression and identity. So all of these are issues that need to be addressed by the organization, because in the absence of a SOGI law that protects us, we cannot rely on city ordinances. And in organizations, I think a lot needs to be discussed. For instance, it has also been said that a lot of bullying, for instance, more so in the COVID era, is rampant, uh, primarily because we cannot, not everyone is empowered to be themselves. And I think the moral of the discussion here is that we need to go beyond, you know, uh, we start with the culture of understanding that will lead to acceptance, but there also has to be a call for action. Meaning, if the how willing is the organization, it could also be a function of leadership, no? Parang in the scheme of priorities of an organization, do leaders recognize that this is a problem, or because we are a product of our milieu, so sasabihin nila hindi naman problema yan eh, we're open naman yan eh. But that comes from a heterosexual privilege eh, no? Parang the struggles of a gay man, I don't know, I don't even know, because in our discussion in the LGBT community, we had to come across that point na parang, I grew up in the 80s. I'm a product of a Catholic boys' school. We had to come across that situation that, do we kill ourselves because there's something wrong with us? I come from a generation where the academe believes uh, in the clinical, and in the that we have to be cured, no? So there's a gay conversion therapy session in the 80s in my school, and I was like, what, 9 years old, 10 years old, and my understanding, my concrete understanding of who I was or who I am at this juncture has not been solidified at that point. So we have to go beyond, like, all this understanding of concepts, and it's really phases eh? Like how ready is the organization? It's a function of leadership. Agency is also, not everyone has the agency to live their lives, to thrive. As a gay person, I have to work harder, I have to explain my existence and my humanity. I have to explain why I have the same rights as straight people. I mean, we're talking about all this. And by the way, Gio, I have to thank you for, like, putting in you use your Philippine Studies training, and I appreciate that. But also in our experiences, notice how much gay people would have to work extra harder or much harder to prove their humanity, and how we put this battle in our organizations. So I think as an interesting insight is that we should not compartmentalize this as a problem on its own, but oppression is intersectional. If you're poor, economically poor, you're gay, you have a very feminine, you're trans, for instance, your story is very different from the story of a privileged gay man. And the language is just one thing, but also, like, for instance, uh, in human resource processes, for instance, do they recognize that sexual? Do they have an idea? Of course, again, this is funny, no, but people cannot really differentiate sexual orientation from gender identity at this juncture. Parang, like, I mean, uh, isa lang naman yan, bakla lang naman yan, wala namang trans woman, or they don't understand that there's such thing as a trans woman homosexual and a trans woman heterosexual. So again, for organizations, in the absence of a law, again, like, there has to be some sort of gender framework, a point system where it is integrated in the processes. Because again, we ask ourselves, maybe us, we're ready for this, but it is a function of leadership. How do we rank this in terms of of priority, or and of course again, di ba, because we're invisible, remember the LGBT community, you need to have an evidence-based study that focused on, like, for instance, in terms of bullying, in terms of sexual abuse that have not been reported. There were already reports about incidences that are higher in the LGBT community. Rape is rape regardless, but because we are being invalidated, we are being oppressed in that sense, or not recognizing our presence is an oppression, because you don't exist, and therefore what problems you have, they don't, it's not important in a certain organization. But there are also, interesting enough, uh, best practices in some organizations about gender and development in the workplace, particularly also not limited to the gender fair language, but also it's incorporated in their day-to-day activities. So also, di ba, halimbawa, like the application, for instance, these are just minute things, eh, no? Parang, okay, dalawa lang, male, female. So I'm applying to a college, male, female, or where do I belong, or so. And of course, beyond the organization, you have the legality, you know. So para uh, you have a relationship that is not recognized, so there are no laws that protect you. Parang it's so easy for heterosexual couples to be protected by law, but for us people, you know, I mean, a lot of work has to be done. I mean, obviously, growing up in the 80s, where AIDS was like a death sentence to all gay people, even if we, you know, I mean, if even if we have not really gone through that sexual maturity yet, no? So parang if you're gay, automatically, uh, you in the 80s, you'll die of HIV or AIDS. So, but also let's also address the issue of, kasi like this discussion by Gio, also because there seems to be an issue that you will confront, I mean, reconciling your faith, because Binilde is a Catholic institution. So like, so how do we intersect the our faith and humanity with our sexual orientation and gender identity? I think I've said a lot, so I'll give the floor to Sergio.
Okay, thank you po, Sir George. Very enlightening. Actually, given the limited space, hindi ko and time for the discussion, hindi ko na na-touch yung mga ano nyo, yung nabanggit nyo. But I think I, in a sense, parang touched that when I talked about the gay normality. Pero of course, that needs to be parang further delved upon. Yung point ni Sir kanina, ni Sir George, is that yung identity struggles natin should not be separate from the socio-economic ones. Si Nancy Fraser, a feminist philosopher, no? An American feminist philosopher, meron siyang tinatawag na ano eh, na two dimensions of injustices. I think that reminds me habang nung nag-share si Sir George nung insight niya na uh, ang pinopoint ni Fraser is that hindi natin dapat tinitingnan lang itong uh, politika ng LGBT or ng SOGI as a to use the term compartmentalized or parang on its own, but rather it intersects with the reality of our socio-economic lives, no? Parang pina-fracture ng material conditions, no, yung experiences natin, but it does not mean to say that we should subordinate our struggle for recognition, no, over or under the struggle for parang the primacy of class struggle, kasi may ganyang phase sa ano eh sa history ng ng LGBT movement, if I could call it a movement, no. Kasi I think as a movement kailangan mas matibay pa yung solidarity. Nagkaroon ng ganyang phase. I think it was around the 90s. Kaya um medyo mainit yung yung banggaan ng kaliwa yung kaliwang-kaliwa versus yung mga nag-oorganisa ng LGBT movement kasi parang binabrand lang ang LGBT as a form of identity politics to the point na yung word na identity politics becomes something derogatory or pejorative, no, in activism. Pero for me, I think pwede namang maging sabay yung ganitong struggles, no, na yung maganda yung binanggit ni sir na na intersectional. So parang instead of looking siguro na additive yung struggle na you have the economic class on one hand and you have the gender on the other and you have the faith, you have your family issues, your school. Maganda siyang tignan as multifaceted, no? No. I think baka marami na naman nasasabi. Ayun. And then in terms of faith, actually ano rin siya, medyo sensitive na topic at mahirap siyang i-reconcile, to be honest. Even I personally I'm a practicing Catholic and ganito yung views ko on gender. I'm aware that my religious affiliation is not open-minded yet in this topic. Pero uh, the point is I think on we can what do you call that? Parang yung kanina sa part na I said na parang let's be a safe space to everyone. I think ang point nun is that uh, when we achieve that point, I think we can, or enable to achieve that point, we should learn to agree that we can disagree. Diba? Sometimes you have your belief on religious belief, no, that contradicts my person, the way that I identify, but that should not be a hindrance for us to coexist as diplomatic human beings. And with that, yon.
Okay, okay. Hi, my name is Tin po. I'm an architecture student from the La Salle College of St. Benilde. I'm currently taking up my college thesis and my ultimate goal is to design a wellness retreat haven to foster family acceptance and ultimately strengthen the relationship between the LGBTQIA plus youth and their families in order to secure their confidence within themselves as they against gender-based discrimination by society. So, sir, from your own perspective, what environment or activities can specifically identify as an LGBT space po?
Sorry, medyo na lost. Hindi ko narinig.
So,
From
sir, from your own perspective po, what environment or activities can specifically identify as an LGBT space po?
what space? Sorry. Ulit. Medyo
What activities po, sir, can specifically identify as an LGBT space po? Like ano po yung mga activities na usually um, ginagawa ng community para po ma-translate ko po yung space ko into um, something na parang inclusive for them, sir.
hmm. Okay. Actually, medyo paano ba? We need to parang dissect yung notion ng space. Kasi, um, parang drawing from what Sir George reminded us earlier na when we're talking about the experiences of LGBT persons, we need to consider the varying socioeconomic situation and also their respective contexts, which would parang give us an indication yung degree of struggle and the degree of danger that they are encountering in the everyday context. Why I'm saying this? Kasi with the notion of space, medyo, to be honest, nahihirapan ako i-articulate siya. Pero what do you mean by space? I think sa pag-frame mo ng question, you're talking of space as something that is external, that is open, that can be seen, that you can actually get into, and then 'di ba, yung physical space. Uh, but may ganitong field may ganitong field of studies sa cultural studies, parang placemaking ng ganyan, no? O na tinatawag, no? Ang problem lang sa gender non-conforming persons, no, yung problem na-encounter ng gender non-conforming persons ang LGBTQ+ ay dahil hindi malakas yung discrimination um no sa sa gender non-conforming ay may danger, no, yung pag-expose ng sarili in certain spaces. So, kaya ito yung medyo struggle na part for me kasi kung may ganitong danger, most likely hindi nila i-expose yung sarili nila na explicitly this is an LGBT space. So parang ganun yung nakikita kong problem, no? In a sense, this also explains bakit nagkakaroon ng mga underground spaces kung saan ine-express yung gender at saka yung sexual side ng tao. I'm not sure if everyone is aware, no? Di ba sa Twitter may mga hashtag alter, you have yung mga gay apps, di ba? Gay dating apps, di ba? You have that, no? Ngayon, kaya nagkakaroon ng ganitong spaces kasi nga because we are vulnerable from discrimination and social stigma, naghahanap tayo ng paraan para makapag-express tayo in a safer space pero nang hindi nakikita ng larger community. So, yun yung ano ko, yung perspective ko in terms of space. Now, going to your own project na gusto mong makita as something LGBT friendly or LGBT embracing yung how to create an LGBT embracing space. Well, medyo radical tong position pero I think we need to obliterate all forms of signifiers on gender. On that way, kung walang labels, walang meanings, walang description of any particular gender that on that space, that will be the most embracing space. Yung wala mismong label or wala mismong description. So siguro parang on a conceptual art level, this space does not discriminate. May ganong nakalagay. And then that's I don't know, I'm just trying to conceive no how to respond to that proper yung question proper. I'm not an expert on designing spaces. So yun yung best answer na bibigay ko. So medyo radical in a sense kasi ang sinasabi ko, let's dismantle all the distinctions na parang diba, you discriminate in terms of whether this person is straight or bi or what or top bottom versus side whatever. So with all this being dismantled, everyone is welcome. So that's my answer. So I hope I satisfied the question.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much po.
Thank you.
Ayan, thank you, Tin, for that question. We will be, due to time constraints, we will be entertaining this last question from Richie Paul.
Hi.
Hello.
It's a question. Sorry, this is Richie Paul. Also, he's a deaf, so I'll be interpreting for him.
Okay.
I think I was about 5 or 6 years old. Was playing outside of my home. So this is an experience, and then of course, that was the time. At that time, I was very innocent. So I didn't know yet about all these LGBT concepts. And so my relationship with my parents at that time, they did not explain to me what these concepts are. So growing up with my siblings, I of course I have myself identifying differently from what the norm is. I experience a lot of abuse, a lot of abuses, physical abuses from my family. So of course, for me as a child, that was very traumatic back then, identifying myself as a gay person. But of course, out of deference, out of respect to my parents, to my family, my only wish is that they would be accepting of who I am. But then again, as you have mentioned, it's very different from how they define, as normal, as how I see myself. So yeah.
Okay, so sorry. The question being is,
So the question is, so if for example, how there are certain stereotypes, for children, such as boys should not be playing with dolls, and girls should be playing with it's only for girls. But of course I have to, you know well, that's my interest. I'm really interested with dolls, so I have to play it, na try to hide it from my family. But of course they would notice that I'm playing I'll be playing with dolls. And so again, the labels that are associated because of those things, because of those stereotypes, and the abuse that are associated with that. So how do we actually deal with those kinds of situation? How do we address stereotypes, um, you know as with the effects of experiencing physical abuse or trauma from the family?
yeah. Um, okay. Okay, thank you. Okay, sorry, I'm just trying to form my thoughts. No, um, actually, that's a real struggle. I mean, kasi di ba parang I mentioned din earlier that we think na sa family yung safest space, pero doon din nangyayari. It's in the family where the abuses and also the discrimination begins. No, and uh, it's so sad to learn you went through that. And um, as much as we parang each of us have different versions of similar struggles, no, uh, that's the point of this kind of session, this kind of talk. And also that is the point of the wider struggle for, yung binabanggit kanina ni Sir George, na wider or broader gender framework. We want to change the perspective of each people para hindi na magkaroon ng ganitong thinking na you can outright abuse, harm a person because he, or they are genderly different, no? Na ang parang yun yung yun yung part ng struggle natin for a recognition na hindi kayang tumbasan ng struggle against for redistribution or yung social economic side ng struggle. Kasi the social economic side of the struggle is saying that the we have different gender sexual diverse identities. Yung more visible, the more vulnerable identities such as the trans women, the so-called parlorista, etc., are prone to socio-economic disadvantage kasi our society would not accept a trans person for some kind of work, no, even being a gay person or a lesbian person would also endanger a professional. For instance, a working class a teacher, halimbawa, may mga eskwelahan na traditional pa rin na hindi na dini-discourage yung mga teacher na maging open sa kanilang sexuality in the workplace. And that is really a hard thing to do. I mean, on a personal level, that would further stretch to the professional and the political side. Now, uh, ngayon, we have that and it's a concrete struggle that we need to dismantle yung social, the economic, and even yung legal frameworks natin. Pero on the other side of the spectrum, we have our personal, our self-identification as also a form of struggle. It's a parang simultaneous struggle siya, 'di ba, yung two dimensions, no? And ito yung part ng struggle natin, more on the personal level, na hindi din natin pwedeng bitawan. So what I'm saying is that, um yung ganitong sessions, on ganitong talks on not reviving, but rather recovering and rediscovering perspectives from different periods in the past and from different cultures, enable for us to reframe our mindset, and also to rethink our values and how we value things, no, para magkaroon tayo ng mas egalitarian na society, no, hindi in the future, but we want it now. So um I think it's parang it requires a wider movement, no, and a stronger and a wider movement, and able for us to have a more inclusive and a more a healthier environment, no, regardless of our gender sexual diversities. Actually, to the point nga na sana hindi na magiging issue, or hindi na dapat issue kung ano yung sexualidad o gender ng isang tao. Kasi pag na-obliterate natin 'yan, 'di ba, yung ganung differences, 'di ba? Baka mas makapag-focus din tayo doon sa mas konkretong level din ng struggle, yung binabanggit nga na socio-economic or yung class struggle. So this is not to dismiss, no, yung one or the other, but we want to say that these are co-equal forms of, or they are both valid forms of struggle. So I don't know if I answered the question fully. No, pero my point is that this kind of session should lead to a change in perspective. A change of perspective will lead to a healthier spaces, not just a space that we could say that ito yung safe space, ito yung hindi safe na space, but we want everyone to be safe, no, whether it's within our inner circles or within the larger society. So, yon. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Sir Gio. Hopefully po na-answer ni Sir Gio yung question ng ating deaf student. Thank you so much po. Okay. So, everyone, due to time constraints, as mentioned earlier, we can no longer be accepting questions. But if ever you may want to reach Sergio for if hindi kayo nakaabot sa time, if you missed it, it's at grcaligia dot that's three I's, at gmail.com. You may refer to the chat, everyone. It's there. The email is there.
All right, before we end, I would like to invite Ms. Nikki Templo Perez, Director of the Center for Inclusive Education, to present the Certificate of Appreciation to Mr. Gio Caliguia, as well as her closing remarks.
Right. Hello, everyone. So Gio, again, thank you very much for that very informative session. And on behalf of the De La Salle College of St. Benilde and the different offices and student organizations and student groups that organized today's event, we present you with the Certificate of Appreciation. And I will allow me to read it. The Certificate of Appreciation. The certificate is presented to Mr. Gregorio Caliguia for sharing his expertise at the Sense on LGBTQIA+ on March 5, 2021, signed by Maria Veronica Templo Perez, that's me, the Director of the Center for Inclusive Education, Bryce De Vera, the President of Benilde Hive, and Presley Estacio, the President of Benilde Central Student Government. Thank you very much, Gio.
Thank you so much, Jimpo, for inviting me.
Yes. I was also asked to give the closing remarks for this. And after listening to yung very very informative session and very informative Q&A, I was stuck with how am I supposed to give a closing remarks to this? parang ang dami pang kailangang i-digest na information. But let me just share with you 3 of my takeaways from this session. Number 1, I found it very interesting, the part on the history of LGBT and um, the names, diba, the what we call them and how things were before. And it showed, for me, it was very striking that it seemed that we were kinder, more accepting, more respectful of people back then. Parang for me, no, dati hindi man nila naiintindihan kung bakit iba yung ibang tao sa kanila. It didn't matter. It was they were very accepting. So yon. So parang ako, what happened? Did development really help us develop into better beings, or did our development actually parang ano ako, make us lose our values, those values of acceptance, being respectful, ganun. So that's my first takeaway from that. Na parang we were better beings back then. The second, I think my second takeaway is that it seems we have a long way to go to get to that point again in our past, that we are respectful, that we are accepting, that we are kinder. But even if we have a long way to go, I think it's good that we start now. That we start now. Yes, there is a struggle sometimes. I'm so proud talaga of Benilde to be the first. I believe, I'm not sure, but I believe we are the first Catholic educational institution to have an LGBT organization accredited by the school. So, ibig sabihin, nakakatanggap ng funding from the school. So, parang I'd like to think that Benilde is really walking the talk of inclusion, and that and because I'd like to think, because we are Catholic, we are inclusive. Because we are Catholic, we are inclusive. And now more than ever, we even have an inclusive Pope. So I really think Pope Francis is an inclusive Pope. So I think that we can, start to be more accepting and more inclusive right now. Tanggalin natin yung pero, yung kinuwento ni Gio ng mga pero. If I may share, one thing being done right now that has been done in the recent years na nakakatuwa din, our School of Hotel, Restaurant, and Institution Management has a very strict dress code. Males are, and Sir Mier, if you're still here, please correct me if I'm wrong, pero ang alam ko, males are supposed to dress this way, and females are supposed to dress this way. And there was a discussion because somebody raised it that my gender identity is not the same as my gender assigned. So are you going to force me to dress this way when I don't feel that I'm like this? I mean, my identity is not this way. So there was a long discussion, and finally, Shrim allowed for transgenders, or those who feel more, for Shrim allowed students to dress in the identity that they were more comfortable with. At yung pinag-uusapan namin to sa hotel school, na pinag-uusapan nila, ang isang come out was, pagdating naman sa industry, tatanggapin ba yan ng hotel? Tapos ang sabi namin, well, then we'll just let them know na tayo sa school, ganito, we will accept, but we cannot assure them that the hotel industry will be as accepting. Pero yung maganda kasi doon is, I think because we are addressing it in the academe, it gives it now legitimacy to be discussed in industry. So maybe that policy in Shrim, in a school, in one of the colleges, may influence the policies of the hotels and even the hotel center, the hotel sector, di ba? Malay natin. And my third point is that, we were talking yung last part about safe spaces, and one thing that I learned, yung spatial justice, and that safe space is not something that holds people together. It's not something that holds people, but a safe space is something that forms people, and it forms us into people whose perspectives are open and accepting and inclusive. And yun nga, totoo, it's a mindset, it's a mind change. And I'm thankful for everyone who is here today. Thank you for being our partners. If you're not, if you're not sold at the end of this na LGBTQ, am I sensitive? Am I accepting? I'm just glad that you listened until the end. And that maybe you can start thinking about how to be more accepting or inclusive, how to, kung ano man yung struggles inside of being accepting and inclusive and sensitive to the LGBTQIA community, then hopefully, and I'm sure everything that you heard will be very helpful as you approach the weekend. Tas maybe, pag nilay-nilayan natin over the weekend, bakit hindi? Right. So thank you everyone for joining us today, and thank you again to Gio for being with us. And I wish you all the best in your thesis defense, Gio.
Thank you po, Miss
Okay.
Nikki.
Right. So yon, thank you. Thank you very much, everyone. Happy weekend.
I'm sorry. Once again, we would like to thank Mr. Gio Caliguia for sharing his expertise in this topic. We would also like to thank CSG, Beehive, and CAE for making this webinar possible. We would also like to acknowledge the team behind this event: Selena D. Lim, Charlize Jimenez, Isa Rimando, Camira Sarmiento, yours truly, Kyla Amor, Presley Estacio, Bryce De Vera, and Jeremiah So Adriano. And of course, we would like to thank you for joining us this afternoon. Once again, I'm Kyla Amor. Thank you very much and have a wonderful night.